Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The Missing Dots, the place where we connect the dots that others are afraid to touch. Today we dive into one of the most misunderstood topics in Islamic history. Why do different madhabs exist? Were they borrowed from other religions? Did people create them for power, politics, or piety? Who decides who can start a madhab and what happens when someone tries? And most importantly, have madhabs strengthened Islam or divided it? And most importantly, in this episode, we confront the questions raised by atheists, ex-Muslims, traditional scholars, and modern Muslims, questions many avoid. But every thinking Muslim deserves answers to. And most importantly, let's uncover the truth with evidence, history, and intellectual honesty, because understanding Islam should never be a taboo. So to start off, I want to talk directly to you, the listener. Today, we are looking at this massive, highly detailed compilation of academic research, historical data, and theological texts.
Yeah, it's really an extensive collection of sources.
It really is. And it attempts to answer basically 100 of the most uncomfortable, probing questions about the madhab system. So our mission today is to just cut through all the noise, the sectarianism, and the myths.
Right, to understand the actual mechanics of Islamic jurisprudence. And what's fascinating here is that, alhamdulillah, the sources provide a genuinely balanced scholarly view.
Yeah, they don't really shy away from anything.
No, they don't. They address everyone from atheists and ex-Muslims to traditional scholars and modern reformists. It's a very comprehensive look at the source material.
Honestly, before we get into the really intense historical debates, we need to sort out the basic terminology. Because right out of the gate, there is a massive definition disconnect.
Oh, absolutely. The terminology gets mangled all the time.
I mean, I hear people compare this system to Christian denominations literally all the time. Someone will say, oh, you're Hanafi and he's Shafi'i. So that's basically like Catholics versus Protestants, right?
Yeah, I hear that constantly.
So is that an accurate analogy at all? Because it assumes the four Sunni madhabs are basically competing sects.
That is probably the most common category error made when looking at Islamic history. It's entirely inaccurate. To untangle it, we have to actually look at the Arabic language itself.
Okay, let's unpack that. Where does the word even come from?
Well, the word madhab, and its plural madhahib, originates from the root letters DHHB. Literally translated, it just means to go or to take a path.
A path, not a fast.
But in the context of Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, it represents a methodological school of thought. It's a structured pathway for interpreting texts. It is emphatically not a sect.
Okay, so what is a sect then in Arabic?
The Arabic word for a sect, like a group that breaks away on fundamental theological grounds, is a firqa.
Got it. So a madhab is a pathway to understanding the text versus a firqa, which is like a walled garden that keeps everyone else out.
Exactly the distinction.
Yeah.
And the mechanism behind this difference lies in how Islamic theology categorizes belief versus action. There is a very rigid separation between usul and furu.
Usul being the fundamentals.
Yes, usul encompasses the core creed, the aqidah. This is the absolute bedrock of the faith. We are talking about belief in the oneness of God, the finality of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right, things like the Day of Judgment, the angels, the Quran.
Exactly. The obligation of the 5 daily prayers, fasting in Ramadan, giving zakat. On these fundamentals, all 4 major Sunni schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, agree entirely.
Like 100% agreement.
100%.
So.
There is not a millimeter of divergence on the usul.
Okay, so the foundation of the house is identical. Where do the branches, the furus, come into play then?
The furus represent the specific, detailed legal applications. How exactly do you place your hands during the prayer? What specifically invalidates a complex commercial contract?
Ah, so the day-to-day granular stuff.
Right. Like, how do you calculate zakat on a newly invented digital currency? This is where the divergence happens, and this is exactly why the Catholic versus Protestant analogy completely disintegrates.
Because they differ on the actual foundations.
Yeah. Exactly. Christian denominations historically differed on massive foundational theological concepts, like soteriology.
Soteriology.
The actual doctrine of how a human soul achieves salvation. Historically, you had groups mutually excommunicating each other, believing the other faction was inherently heretical.
But the madhabs don't do that.
Not at all. In complete contrast, the Islamic madhabs mutually recognize each other as completely orthodox and valid pathways to salvation. An adherent of the Maliki school doesn't believe a Hanafi is going to hell just for praying differently.
Right, they pray behind one another in the same mosques all the time.
They do. They
Ah.
intermarry, they study each other's legal texts.
I've always thought about it kind of like the Supreme Court. Let me test this analogy with you.
Sure, go ahead.
So you have 9 justices, and they're all looking at the exact same foundational document, the Constitution. But you have strict textualists who argue you can only look at the exact letter of the law. And then you have pragmatists or originalists looking at historical context or the overarching intent. They're all fiercely loyal to the Constitution. They all recognize each other as valid justices, but their methodologies are fundamentally different.
That analogy holds up incredibly well, actually. The imams of these 4 schools were not just inventing new laws out of thin air, they were developing highly sophisticated legal methodologies.
Which is called usul al-fiqh, right?
Yes, the principles of jurisprudence. They are taking the exact same primary sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, and applying different interpretive philosophies to extract rulings from them. They are essentially establishing the rules of engagement.
Wait, hold on. I get that they are reading the same book, so this brings up a massive historical accusation from the sources we're looking at.
Which one?
A lot of skeptics, particularly Orientalist historians and modern atheists, argue that this entire system was just plagiarized, the borrowed religion myth.
Ah, yes. The idea that it was all copied.
Yeah. They claim that when the early Muslim armies expanded and conquered the Byzantine and Sassanid empires, they just absorbed Roman provincial law or copied Talmudic schools and slapped an Arabic label on it.
It's a very old accusation, and honestly a very tired one. Mid-20th century scholars built their careers pushing the idea that Islamic law was heavily derivative of Roman or Jewish law.
But the sources we are analyzing say otherwise.
Absolutely. More rigorous contemporary scholarship, looking at the actual papyri and early manuscripts, explicitly debunks this. Islamic jurisprudence developed organically from internal indigenous sources.
Okay, so walk me through the historical timeline. How did it actually happen?
Well, you have to look at the 7th and 8th centuries CE. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, passed away, the community faced an immediate crisis.
Because they couldn't just go ask him questions anymore.
Precisely. For 23 years, if a companion had a question about trade or marriage, they just asked him, and Revelation provided a direct answer. But once he passed, that direct line ceased.
So they are suddenly holding a closed text, but life just keeps moving forward.
And life didn't just move forward, it exploded geographically. Within a few decades, the Muslim empire expanded rapidly across vast, incredibly diverse territories.
From Spain all the way to India. Right.
Exactly. They encountered realities the original inhabitants of Mecca and Medina couldn't have even imagined. The legal schools grew organically in direct response to these specific geographical realities.
It wasn't foreign borrowing, it was just internal problem solving.
Right. Let's look at the actual environments where these methodologies were born. Take the Hanafi school, for example, founded by Imam Abu Hanifa.
He was in Kufa, in Iraq, right?
Yes, and Kufa was not some quiet desert town. It was a massive, bustling, cosmopolitan commercial center. You had Persians, Arabs, Christians, Jews, and traders from the East all colliding.
A total melting pot.
Completely. And Imam Abu Hanifa himself was a highly successful silk merchant, so he understood market dynamics intimately. They were encountering complex forward sales and agricultural sharecropping agreements there.
Things that simply didn't exist in the simple economy of 7th century Medina.
Exactly. So you can't just open a book and find a specific verse about a Persian agricultural futures contract.
Because the issue didn't exist when the text was revealed.
Precisely. Because of this, Imam Abu Hanifa and his students realized that a strict literalist reading wasn't going to suffice. Their methodology naturally required flexible analogical reasoning, which is called qiyas.
Okay, how does qiyas work?
If the text prohibits X because of reason Y, and a new situation Z also contains reason Y, then Z is also prohibited. Furthermore, they developed the concept of istihsan, or juristic preference.
Wait, skeptics might hear juristic preference and think it just means the judge decides to do whatever he feels like doing.
That's a really important clarification to make. Istihsan is not whim. It operates when applying a strict analogy would actually lead to a severely unjust outcome in an edge case.
So it's a safety valve.
Yes, it allows the jurist to opt for a ruling that preserves the overarching spirit of the law, which is justice and public welfare. It's highly disciplined.
So the Hanafis were the rationalists dealing with a complex society. Now, contrast that with Imam Malik in Medina, That feels like the complete opposite end of the spectrum.
It was a completely different world. Medina was the city of the prophet. It was insulated from the massive cosmopolitan influx and the commercial variations of Iraq.
Right. The families living there were the direct descendants of the companions.
Exactly. So Imam Malik's brilliant methodological contribution was his reliance on Amal al-Medina. That means the living, continuous practice of the people of Medina.
So he valued what the community was physically doing over isolated pieces of paper.
His logic was profoundly empirical. If the entire city practically applied a ruling in their daily lives, generation after generation, from the prophet down to Malik's time,
Then that mass-transmitted living practice is basically undeniable.
far stronger than a single, isolated written hadith narrated by one person. Think about it like learning how to pray. You don't learn by reading a manual.
Right, you learn by standing next to your dad, who stood next to his dad.
Exactly. Imam Malik codified that living tradition.
So we have the rationalists in Iraq and the traditionalists in Medina. Where does Imam Shafi fit into all of this?
Imam Shafi is arguably the great synthesizer. He traveled everywhere. He grew up in Mecca, studied under Malik in Medina, then went to Yemen, then up to Iraq to study Hanafi methodology.
Wow, so he saw all the different approaches firsthand.
He did. And he realized the system needed a universally agreed upon hierarchy to prevent the law from fracturing. He systematized the exact relationship between text and human reason.
So he basically laid down the precise rules for how to weigh a Quranic verse against a hadith or against scholarly consensus.
Exactly. He built the operating system that everyone else ended up running their software on. And finally, you had the Hanbali school, founded by Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal in Baghdad.
His story is pretty intense, right? It was
Yes, it is.
defined by a massive crisis with the government.
Yes, the Abbasid government had adopted a theological position pushed by the Mutazilites. They were heavily influenced by translated Greek philosophy and believed human reason should reign supreme over revelation.
And the state literally launched an inquisition, didn't they? The Mina.
They did. They tortured and imprisoned scholars to force them to adopt this state-mandated rationalism. Imam Ahmad was tortured and imprisoned by the caliph for years because he refused to capitulate.
MashaAllah, the sheer integrity of these men is just stunning. They were resisting the state at the cost of their own lives.
His methodology was a staunch reaction against philosophical overreach. He emphasized extreme textualism to protect the religion from being diluted by arrogant human logic.
So they were definitely not government puppets. I mean, we talked about Ahmad surviving torture, and Imam Malik literally refused Khalifa Mansur.
Yes. The caliph offered to make Malik's book the supreme law of the entire empire, and Malik refused, saying, "Do not force the people into one opinion."
And Abu Hanifa died in prison because he refused to be a state judge. He knew the government would just pressure him to rule in their favor.
Exactly. The history of Islamic jurisprudence is actually the history of profound resistance to state control.
Okay, so knowing they originated organically and knowing these scholars were heroes of integrity, that's a great historical defense. But it still leaves a glaring logical question.
Which is?
A major objection raised by atheists and ex-Muslims today. The thing is, how can a perfect, unchanging religion have 4 different correct answers to the exact same question?
That is the paradox of pluralism.
Right. If God is omniscient and the Quran is clear, why is there any ambiguity at all? If the law is divine, shouldn't it be mathematically precise?
It's an incredibly sharp question. The underlying assumption there is that perfection equals monolithic uniformity. But we have to look at the intent of the lawgiver.
Okay, so why didn't God just make every single verse have only one unarguable interpretation?
Because of a concept called epistemic humility. In Islamic jurisprudence, texts are divided into 2 distinct categories. There is qati, which means absolute, definitive certainty.
So 0 room for debate on those.
None. The prohibition of murder, the prohibition of usury, fasting in Ramadan, you will never find a legitimate scholar arguing that fasting is just a metaphor.
Right. But what about the other category?
The second category is zani, which means probabilistic or open to multiple interpretations. The vast majority of legal texts regarding the furu, the details, fall into the zani category.
But why deliberately use ambiguous language?
To accommodate diverse human conditions across vast expanses of time, geography, and culture.
Okay, I need a concrete example of this. How can a single word legitimately generate 2 completely different laws?
Let's look at a famous example regarding wudu, ritual purity. There is a verse in the Quran detailing what breaks your wudu. It uses the Arabic word lamastum, which means if you have touched women.
Okay, touched. Seems straightforward.
But the root of this word is lambs. Linguistically, it can literally mean physical skin-to-skin contact. But in classical Arabic poetry and colloquial usage, lambs is also widely used as a polite metaphor for intimate relations.
So the word inherently carries a dual meaning.
Exactly. So Imam Shafi looks at the verse. His methodology dictates that unless there is overwhelming evidence to abandon the literal meaning, you stick to it.
Therefore, any intentional skin-to-skin contact between a man and a woman who are not immediate family breaks the wudu.
Correct. Now, Imam Abu Hanifa approaches the exact same word. His methodology looks deeply at the surrounding context of the verse and cross-references it with hadith reports.
Reports where the prophet purportedly kissed his wife and then prayed without renewing his wudu, right?
Yes. So the Hanafi school concludes that the word lamastum in this specific verse is employing the metaphorical meaning. Therefore, simple physical touch does not break wudu.
Both the scholars are looking at the exact same word. Both have rigorous, textually sound defenses, but the practical output is completely opposed.
And this isn't a flaw. It's a built-in feature of divine mercy called Rama. If every single rule was absolute and rigid, it would have suffocated the human experience.
Honestly, I never thought about it that way. The skeptics say ambiguity is proof of human error, but this framework suggests it's an intentional design feature for human survival.
It creates an elasticity in the law, allowing it to stretch and adapt without ever breaking the core Qadi boundaries.
It's not relative truth where everything goes. It's epistemic pluralism, where rigorous human effort is actually rewarded, like that famous hadith about the judge, right?
Yes, the Prophet, peace be upon him, stated that if a judge strives to make a ruling using the proper methodology and gets it right, he receives 2 rewards from God.
And if he strives with the same sincerity and gets it wrong, he still receives 1 reward.
Exactly. It validates the human intellectual effort. It declares that God values the sincere, methodologically sound pursuit of truth just as much as the conclusion itself.
It institutionalizes humility. You can say my ruling is correct, with the possibility of being wrong.
And my opponent's ruling is wrong with the possibility of being correct.
But wait, let me challenge that for a second. If difference is a mercy, does that mean I can just treat the madhabs like a buffet?
What do you mean by a buffet?
Like, say I'm an average Muslim today. I want the easiest possible life. I take the Hanafi rule for wudu so I don't have to rewash. I take the Maliki rule for food because it's more permissive on seafood.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Yeah, I just bounce around patching together a custom-made, frictionless religion. Isn't that utilizing the mercy of the system?
That is a very common impulse. Classical scholars were acutely aware of it. It's a practice called talfiq, which means patching, or tashabu, which is cherry-picking lenient rulings purely for personal convenience.
And I assume they weren't big fans of that.
Not at all. Giants like Ibn Taymiyyah strictly prohibited this kind of fatwa shopping.
But why? If all the rulings are technically valid, what's the harm in combining them?
The reason is profoundly theological. The purpose of Islamic law is to train the human soul to submit to the will of God. If you systematically bounce between schools looking only for the easiest outcome,
then you aren't submitting to God's law, you're submitting to your own desires.
exactly, you are turning religion into a servant of your own hawa, your own ego. You are reverse engineering the law to rubber stamp what you already want to do.
You're just hiring different lawyers until one tells you what you want to hear.
Exactly. Furthermore, there is a structural integrity argument. A layperson is expected to follow one cohesive framework because that framework possesses internal logic and consistency.
Give me a mechanical example of how that breaks down if you mix them.
Suppose you combine rulings regarding a marriage contract. You take the Hanafi ruling that a woman doesn't need a guardian, a wali, to validate the marriage.
Okay, which makes it easier to get married.
But then you take the Maliki ruling that witnesses don't need to be present at the exact moment of the contract, only at consummation.
Oh, I see.
If you patch those 2 together, you might end up with a marriage contract that is completely invalid in both the Hanafi and Maliki schools simultaneously.
Because you pulled a load-bearing brick out of the Hanafi structure and jammed it into a Maliki building.
Exactly. You compromise the structural integrity of both.
Okay, I understand the necessity of consistency, but this requirement brings up some very intense modern critiques from ex-Muslims and modernists.
Yes, trauma-based critiques.
Right, they ask, didn't this demand for consistency eventually just enable patriarchal control? Didn't freeze Islamic law in the 8th century? What about the closing of the gates of ijtihad?
It's an incredibly pervasive narrative. You hear it constantly. Did these schools basically form a cartel and lock the doors to independent thought?
Did they?
Modern historical scholarship paints a vastly more nuanced picture. Let's dismantle the closing of the gates of Ijtihad myth first.
Okay, let's do it.
The sources point out that this concept was never a theological dogma. The gates of independent reasoning never closed theologically. The Quran never commanded it.
So how did they close then?
They closed institutionally. It was essentially a massive defense mechanism. As the Islamic Empire fractured politically, with warlords and corrupt governors taking power, the law became vulnerable.
Because anyone could just claim to be an independent jurist and mujtahid.
Exactly. Corrupt rulers could simply hire unqualified charlatans to invent new methodologies that justified their tyranny or taxation.
Oh, wow. So insisting on the 4 recognized madhabs was actually a fortress against political manipulation.
Yes. They said, unless you possess the towering intellect of Imam Shafi'i, you cannot invent a new school. It protected the rule of law from dictators.
Okay, so the stagnation was a survival tactic. But what about the rigidity? The feeling that the law is just a frozen relic?
To understand that trauma, we have to look closely at the devastating impact of European colonialism. What many people view today as traditional Islamic law is actually a colonial artifact.
Wait, really? How so?
Let's look at British India. The British East India Company wanted to rule the massive Muslim population efficiently, but the British legal mind was built on common law and rigid statutes.
They wanted a neat, organized rule book.
Right, but Islamic law didn't work like that. Historically, an Islamic judge, a qadi, had immense flexibility in the courtroom. He used concepts like juristic equity or local custom to ensure localized justice.
So it was handled on a case-by-case basis.
Yes. For example, classical law allowed a qadi significant leeway to grant a woman a divorce if she was in an abusive marriage, utilizing local community standards to determine harm.
It was a deeply human, flexible system.
It was. So how did the British break that? They took classical legal manuals, had them translated into Persian, and then translated again into English.
By people who probably didn't grasp the nuances of Arabic legal theory at all.
Exactly. And then they codified these poor translations into rigid statutes. They created an entirely new, bizarre hybrid called Anglo-Mohammedan law.
So they literally stripped away the qadi's ability to use equity or custom.
They killed the flexibility. If a woman came seeking a divorce, the British-appointed judge wouldn't look at equity. He would look at the rigid English translation of a 12th century text and say, the book says X, therefore no divorce.
That is wild. They turned a fluid, living jurisprudence into a rigid Victorian legal code.
Much of the patriarchal trauma that modern Muslims rebel against is actually a rebellion against this post-colonial freezing of the law, not the classical madhab system itself.
It's actually pretty simple to see why some modern Muslims look at this frozen colonial legacy and say, let's just scrap the madhabs entirely.
Right, the desire to go straight back to the Quran and Sunnah.
Exactly. This brings us to the Salafi or reformist desire for a madhabless Islam, the Karma Qualid movement. Cut out the 1,200 years of middlemen.
And we have to acknowledge that the impulse behind that movement is very sincere. It comes from a desire for authenticity.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Isn't following a madhab just blind following? Doesn't the Quran explicitly condemn taking scholars as lords?
This is perhaps the most critical epistemological debate happening today. To answer it, we have to deconstruct what blind following actually means.
Okay, break it down for me.
Classical scholars make a sharp distinction between two concepts, Kuburiya and Tawakkul ilmi. Kuburiya is blind fanaticism.
Like treating a human being as infallible.
Yes, following a scholar even when their fatwa clearly contradicts established divine revelation, that is unequivocally forbidden in Islam.
Okay, so what is tawakkul ilmi?
It translates to epistemic reliance. It is the rational act of trusting the expertise of someone who is vastly more qualified than yourself in a highly technical field.
I need an analogy here. How is this different from just blindly agreeing with someone?
Let's look at it like navigation. Imagine you were dropped in the middle of a perilous wilderness. You need to find true north to survive.
Okay.
The direct access movement says you don't need a map made by someone else. The iron ore is right there in the ground. Just dig up the ore, smelt the iron, magnetize it yourself, and find north.
Which sounds great in theory, but impossible in practice.
Exactly. The madhab approach says, yes, the iron ore, the Quran and Sunnah is perfect and divine, but smelting that ore into a precise compass requires massive metallurgical expertise.
Imam Shafi'i spent his entire life building an incredibly precise compass.
Right. You, as a layman, do not have the tools or the knowledge to forge your own compass from scratch. Use the master's compass.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it, because the reality is the idea of going straight to the sources is a complete modern illusion for 99.9% of people.
It really is. To actually derive a legal ruling directly to reach the rank of a mujtahid requires absolute mastery of 7th century Hijazi Arabic.
Not just conversational Arabic, but the complex poetry and idioms of the Prophet's era.
Exactly. Furthermore, it requires exhaustive knowledge of ilm al-riyal, the science of narrator evaluation.
Explain that a bit more, because I think people just assume a hadith is either stamped true or false in a database.
It is incredibly complex. Let's say you open a translated hadith book and read, "The Prophet said X." You think you are following the Prophet directly,
Right.
but you don't see the chain of transmission. Narrated by person A, who heard it from person B, who heard it from person C.
And you have to know the intimate biographies of all those people.
Yes. Was person B known to have a flawless memory? Did person C develop dementia in his old age? Did person A live in a city where factions were fabricating hadiths?
And what about abrogation?
Well,
Nashk.
exactly. You might read a perfectly authentic hadith commanding an action, entirely unaware that 6 years later, another revelation completely modified that ruling.
So when a layperson with a translated paperback thinks they are going straight to the Prophet, what are they actually doing?
Without a madhab, a layperson isn't following the Prophet directly. They are just blindly following the modern translator or a YouTube influencer or their own unqualified ego.
They're still doing taklid, still following, but just following someone with way less knowledge.
Precisely. Therefore, taklid following qualified scholarship is an instrumental necessity. It is the ultimate safeguard against intellectual arrogance.
So if we absolutely need these frameworks, but we are facing entirely new problems today, what happens next?
You mean modern issues?
Yeah. Things the four imams couldn't have even dreamed of. Could we just build a new one? A fifth madhab for the 21st century. We can't use an 8th century compass to navigate a spacecraft.
This is where the source material gets incredibly fascinating. It explores questions dealing with space travel, bioethics, AI, and cryptocurrency.
Yeah, what about an AI trained on every single classical text, churning out perfectly objective fatwas?
It's a tantalizing sci-fi concept, but jurisprudentially it hits a massive theological wall. The consensus is that establishing a genuinely new fifth madhab requires an individual to reach the rank of mujtahid mutlaq.
An absolute independent jurist.
Right, and the prerequisites for that today are almost insurmountable for a single human being. You'd need mastery of classical Arabic and usul, plus expert-level understanding of modern sociology, macroeconomics, and neuroethics.
Not to mention unparalleled personal piety, completely free from political coercion.
Exactly, and they must achieve widespread recognition by the deeply fractured global scholarly community.
Which is practically impossible today. Getting the global Muslim community to agree on what day Eid starts is hard enough.
Very true. So the consensus is that no single individual today meets these criteria.
So what's the modern solution then? We can't just pause Islamic law.
We don't pause it. Instead of a fifth madhab, scholars use trans-madhab councils and leverage a classical concept called maqasid al-sharia.
The higher objectives of the law.
Yes, classical giants identified 5 core necessities the law protects: religion, life, intellect, lineage, and property. Modern scholars use this meta-framework to tackle unprecedented issues.
Give me a tangible example. How does an 8th century system handle a modern ICU and bioethics?
Let's take brain death and organ transplantation. You won't find a chapter on life support machines in classical Hanafi texts.
Obviously not.
So institutions like the International Islamic Fiqh Academy, the IAFA, gather hundreds of top scholars from all 4 madhabs alongside top neurosurgeons.
They act as a collective mujtahid.
Exactly. They take the medical facts, apply the existing analogical tools, and guide the process through the lens of the Maqasid, specifically the preservation of life.
So they formulate a collective ruling that honors the classical methodology while addressing modern reality.
It's collaborative jurisprudence.
So what does this all mean for a Muslim living in the West today? Do they need a Western madhab?
The sources make a crucial point here. Madhabs are methodological constructs, not geographic prisons.
Meaning?
A Hanafi framework can address Wall Street just as effectively as it addressed 8th century Kufa, provided the scholar understands the modern context.
We don't need a newly invented madhab. We need traditional scholars who intimately understand Western sociological and economic reality.
Exactly. The tools are already in the toolbox. We just need master craftsmen who understand modern architecture.
This brings us to the ultimate question. After 1,200 years, what is the final verdict on the legacy of these schools? Have they strengthened or divided Islam?
If we look at the historical and legal data objectively, sweeping away the polemics, the conclusion is profound. Yes, there were dark periods where political tribalism infected the schools.
Like rival sports hooligans refusing to pray behind one another.
Exactly. But those were corruptions of the system, not features of the methodology. When functioning as designed, the madhabs represent humanity's most sophisticated experiment in legal pluralism.
Legal pluralism maintained within a strict monotheistic framework.
First, they effectively prevented total authoritarian state control of religion. The scholars were the ultimate check on executive power.
And second,
The structural elasticity allowed Islam to adapt globally without fracturing into separate religions. It accommodated Persian, Turkic, African, and Malay cultures while fiercely guarding its core identity.
subhanAllah, the diversity was the exact mechanism that held it all together. I'm picturing a massive suspension bridge.
Oh, how so?
If you build a bridge completely rigid, the first major earthquake snaps it in half. A suspension bridge survives specifically because it is engineered to sway and flex in different areas.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. The methodological diversity provided the flexibility that allowed Islamic civilization to span across continents and survive.
True unity is methodological and ethical harmony, not forced juridical uniformity.
They provided the framework for billions to disagree respectfully on granular details while remaining fiercely united on foundational truths. I actually want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought.
Please do.
If the madhab survived the fall of empires, Mongol invasions, and colonialism by being methodologically brilliant, yet humble enough to admit, my opinion might be wrong.
Yeah.
Perhaps the biggest threat to Islamic jurisprudence today isn't a lack of new madhabs or AI. Perhaps the biggest threat is the modern world's total loss of epistemic humility.
Our cultural obsession with demanding absolute certainty.
Exactly. We demand absolute black and white certainty in areas where God intentionally, mercifully, left room for human grace and the messy reality of sincerely striving for the truth.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.